like that can freeze you in place if you hold on to it too tightly. But something else happened along the way. You kept moving, you kept showing up. Sometimes you didn't even know why. And eventually you found something unexpected. A place, a moment, a time of night when people gather not because everything is perfect, but because they're thinking too. That's why I showed up at 1 in the morning. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being just a series. It became a community, a place where people who are reflecting, questioning, healing, or simply trying to understand the past a little better can sit in the quiet together. And sometimes that's enough to move forward, not because the past disappears, but because you're not carrying it alone anymore. And those are the kinds of things you think about when the world goes dark and everything is quiet and it's 1 in the morning. There are moments in life so painful that even years later, you're not sure. You could fully remember them if you tried, not because they didn't matter, but because your mind protected you from carrying the entire weight of them. Some experiences leave an imprint without leaving a clear picture. You remember the feeling, the heaviness, the confusion, the moment everything shifted. But the details blur, and maybe that's not weakness. Maybe that's survival. Because pain like that can freeze you in place if you hold on to it too tightly. But something else happened along the way. You kept moving, you kept showing up. Sometimes you didn't even know why. And eventually you found something unexpected. A place, a moment, a time of night when people gather not because everything is perfect, but because they're thinking too. That's why I showed up at 1 in the morning. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being just a series. It became a community, a place where people who are reflecting, questioning, healing, or simply trying to understand the past a little better can sit in the quiet together. And sometimes that's enough to move forward, not because the past disappears, but because you're not carrying it alone anymore. And those are the kinds of things you think about when the world goes dark and everything is quiet and it's 1 in the morning. There are moments in life so painful that even years later, you're not sure. You could fully remember them if you tried, not because they didn't matter, but because your mind protected you from carrying the entire weight of them. Some experiences leave an imprint without leaving a clear picture. You remember the feeling, the heaviness, the confusion, the moment everything shifted. But the details blur, and maybe that's not weakness. Maybe that's survival. Because pain like that can freeze you in place if you hold on to it too tightly. But something else happened along the way. You kept moving, you kept showing up. Sometimes you didn't even know why. And eventually you found something unexpected. A place, a moment, a time of night when people gather not because everything is perfect, but because they're thinking too. That's why I showed up at 1 in the morning. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being just a series. It became a community, a place where people who are reflecting, questioning, healing, or simply trying to understand the past a little better can sit in the quiet together. And sometimes that's enough to move forward, not because the past disappears, but because you're not carrying it alone anymore. And those are the kinds of things you think about when the world goes dark and everything is quiet and it's 1 in the morning. Where did the time go? You ask yourself that sometimes, not because the clock stopped working, but because life moved faster than you expected. If you've been around long enough, you've seen people disappear from your life. Some naturally, some suddenly, some in ways you never fully understood. Sometimes it's loss that no one could prevent. Sometimes it's distance that quietly grows until one day the connection is gone. And sometimes it's people who were removed from your life by choices that couldn't be undone. When you live long enough, you begin to carry those memories, the conversations that ended, the relationships that faded, the people who are no longer here, and the people who are no longer the same. Sometimes you look back and realize something else. The person you were then is not the person you are now. The way you responded to things back then is not the way you would respond today. Maybe there were moments you wish you had handled differently. Maybe there were conversations you wish you had never entered. Maybe there were people you should have never responded to in the first place. But time doesn't let you go backward. It only lets you understand, and sometimes that understanding arrives quietly. Late at night, when everything slows down long enough for memory to surface, you start to see the distance between who you were and who you became. And you realize that time didn't just pass. It changed you, it taught you, it shaped the person you had to become in order to keep moving forward. Because the question isn't only where the time went. The real question is what you learned while it was passing. And those are the kinds of things you think about when the world goes dark and everything is quiet and it's 1 a.m. People talk a lot about safe spaces, places where they can feel secure, places where they can feel respected, places where they can be themselves without fear of being torn down. But there's something people forget. There is no safe space where disrespect exists. The moment disrespect enters a room, safety leaves it. It doesn't matter how comfortable the chairs are. It doesn't matter how polite the conversation sounds on the surface. If someone is being dismissed, undermined, mocked, or quietly devalued, the space stops being safe. Because respect is the foundation of safety. Without it, everything else is just decoration. Some people want the comfort of safety without the responsibility of respect. They want to speak however they choose, act however they choose, treat people however they choose, but still expect the environment to remain peaceful. That's not how it works. Disrespect creates tension. It creates distance. It creates a quiet awareness that something is wrong. And once that line is crossed enough times, people stop feeling safe to speak, safe to trust, safe to stay. Because safety isn't created by rules. It's created by how people treat each other when no one is forcing them to behave. And sometimes that realization shows up at 1 a.m. when you reflect on the places you've been, the conversations you've had, the environments that felt supportive, and the ones that slowly became uncomfortable. You begin to understand something simple. Respect isn't optional in a safe space. It's the condition that makes it possible. And those are the kinds of things you think about when the world goes dark and everything is quiet and it's 1 a.m. By the time it reaches 1 a.m., the day is officially over. Whatever happened yesterday, the arguments, the mistakes, the disappointments, the small victories no one noticed, they're behind you now. Midnight doesn't fix anything, but 1 a.m. does something different. It separates you from it. It creates distance. Because once the clock turns, yesterday is no longer happening. It becomes memory. And memory can't control you the way the moment did. The pressure eases, the noise fades, the urgency dies down. And in that quiet space, you begin to see forward, not backward. The failures of the day lose their sharp edge. The conversations lose their heat. The things that felt overwhelming start to look smaller from a distance. Because time moves whether you're ready or not. And at 1 a.m., you're standing in a space that didn't exist a few minutes ago. A new hour, a new day, an untouched stretch of time. Yesterday no longer has authority. It only has lessons. It only has memory. It only has whatever meaning you choose to carry with you. And that's the quiet gift of 1 a.m. It reminds you that endings happen every night. That what felt permanent only lasted until the clock moved forward. That you don't have to relive what already passed. You can reflect on it. You can learn from it. You can release it. And you can begin looking forward. Because the future doesn't ask what happened yesterday, it asks what you're going to do next. And those are the kinds of things you think about when the world goes dark and everything is quiet and it's 1 a.m. Sometimes people wonder why they were left behind. They tell themselves it was circumstance, bad timing, misunderstanding, something temporary. But sometimes the truth is simpler than that. You made choices, not once, not accidentally, but repeatedly. Choices that showed where your priorities were. Choices that showed what you were willing to protect and what you were willing to lose. Growth isn't automatic. Time moves forward whether you grow or not. People assume distance means change. They assume silence means reflection. They assume time alone repairs what was broken. But time doesn't rebuild trust. Time doesn't erase memory. Time doesn't undo actions. Growth requires intention. It requires honesty. It requires someone to look directly at the choices they made and decide to be different. And not everyone does that. So when circumstances change, when paths cross again, when someone thinks they can simply return, there's a question that quietly sits in the room. What exactly has changed? Because situations may evolve, but people remember actions. They remember patterns. They remember the moments when someone showed them exactly who they were. And sometimes the hardest realization at 1 a.m. is understanding that being left behind wasn't about punishment. It was about consequence. And those are the kinds of things you think about when the world goes dark and everything is quiet and it's 1 in the morning. As I sit in the dark tonight, it feels more comfortable than the light. There's something about the quiet of the darkness that makes reflection easier. The world slows down, the noise fades, and for a moment, the weight you carry doesn't feel like something you have to explain to anyone. The reflection of emptiness and darkness can be strangely comforting, not because the feeling is easy, but because it's honest. Sometimes words fail when you try to describe the weight you carry around. It's not always something people can see. It's not always something that shows up in a conversation, but it's there, in the silence, in the late hours, in the moments where you finally allow yourself to sit with the thoughts that follow you through the day. And sometimes the darkness feels easier than the light, because in the darkness, there's no expectation to pretend everything is fine. You can just sit with the truth of what you're feeling. And even though the weight may still be there, there's something about acknowledging it that makes it easier to breathe. And those are the kind of things you think about when the world goes dark and everything is quiet and it's 1 in the morning. Some endings never happen the way we imagine they will. There's no final conversation, no clear explanation, no moment where everything is finally understood. Just silence, just distance, just a chapter that closes without ever fully telling you why. And sometimes that leaves a question sitting in your mind. If you had the chance, would you go back and change it? Would you say the things you never said? Would you ask the questions that were left unanswered? Would you try to rewrite the ending so it felt more complete? At first, most people think they would, because unfinished endings feel uncomfortable. Our minds want resolution, our memories want closure. But time changes perspective. Sometimes you begin to understand that certain endings were never meant to be fully explained. Some moments exist simply as turning points. Moments that redirect the path you were on. Moments that push you toward a future you couldn't see at the time. Not every chapter needs a final sentence. Not every question receives an answer. And sometimes the reason those endings remain unsolved is because the story was never meant to continue in the same direction. Some endings aren't mistakes, they're transitions. And once you recognize that, you stop trying to rewrite the past. You start learning from it. And those are the kinds of things you think about when the world goes dark and everything is quiet and it's 1 in the morning. Sometimes when you walk away from something, people assume the reason is simple. They think you gave up. They think you stopped caring. They think you just decided it wasn't worth it anymore. But sometimes the reason is deeper than that. Sometimes walking away happens because a lesson was learned. A realization that something wasn't working, that something couldn't continue the way it had been. But other times, walking away doesn't come from learning a lesson. It comes from finally realizing the lesson that had been there all along. The signs were present, the patterns were repeating, the understanding was slowly forming. But clarity doesn't always arrive immediately. Sometimes it takes time, sometimes it takes distance. Sometimes it takes one final moment where everything finally makes sense. And in that moment, the question changes. It's no longer, how do I fix this? It becomes, why was I trying to hold on in the first place? Walking away doesn't always mean something failed. Sometimes it means the truth finally became impossible to ignore. Sometimes it means the lesson was finally understood. And once that understanding arrives, continuing the same path no longer makes sense. Because growth doesn't always look like persistence. Sometimes growth looks like release. And those are the kinds of things you think about when the world goes dark and everything is quiet and it's 1 in the morning. Sometimes the lesson was right in front of you, but you missed it. Not because it wasn't there, but because someone directed your attention somewhere else. They pointed to the part that triggered your emotions, the part that made you angry, the part that made you react. And once your emotions were activated, that's where your focus stayed. Because emotion has gravity. It pulls your attention toward the reaction, toward the moment, toward the conflict. But the lesson usually isn't hiding inside the reaction. It's sitting quietly behind it, waiting for someone to step back long enough to see the full picture. Some people understand this. They know that if they can make you emotional enough, you stop examining things carefully. You stop asking the deeper questions. You stop noticing the context around the moment. And suddenly the story becomes simpler than it really is. Just reaction, just outrage, just the surface. But once the emotion fades, once the noise settles, you begin to look at it again. And sometimes that's when you realize something. You weren't wrong to feel what you felt, but someone made sure your attention stayed on the part that triggered you instead of the part that was trying to teach you something. And when you finally see that difference, you start listening more carefully. You start asking different questions. You start recognizing when someone wants your reaction more than they want your understanding. And those are the kinds of things you think about when the world goes dark and everything is quiet and it's 1 in the morning. There comes a moment in everyone's life when reflection arrives. Not because someone forced it, not because someone demanded it, but because something inside you finally asked the question. You sit with yourself and you begin to wonder, did I go too far? Did I say more than I should have? Or maybe the opposite. Should I have been more transparent with my words? Should I have explained what I was thinking? Before things reach this point, reflection doesn't always arrive in the middle of a situation. Most of the time it comes afterward, when the conversation is over, when the emotions settle, when the moment has already passed. And that's when honesty becomes unavoidable, because it's easy to explain things when you're talking to someone else. It's much harder when you're answering yourself. You begin replaying the moment, the tone, the words, the pauses, the decisions you made in real time. Sometimes you realize you stood exactly where you needed to. Other times you recognize there were things you could have done differently. More clarity, more patience, more honesty. Reflection isn't about punishing yourself, it's about understanding yourself. Because the person who is willing to sit with those questions is the person capable of growing from them. And sometimes the quietest moment of the day is the one where you ask yourself the most honest questions. And those are the kinds of things you think about when the world goes dark and everything is quiet and it's 1 in the morning. Sometimes when you look in the mirror, you can still see who you once were. Not just the face, but the memories behind it. The person who believed certain things, the person who trusted certain people, the person who hadn't yet learned the lessons life eventually teaches everyone. And for a moment, it feels like that version of you is still there, just beneath the surface, just behind the eyes, but something changes with time. If you gain wisdom with age, even what you see in the mirror begins to look different. Not because the face itself has changed so dramatically, but because the understanding behind it has. The person looking back at you now has lived through things the younger version never imagined. Loss, growth, mistakes, realizations that only come after experience. And suddenly the reflection isn't just a reminder of who you were. It's a record of who you became. Every lesson adds something. Every challenge reshapes the way you see the world. And the person in the mirror slowly becomes someone who understands more than the person who first stood there years ago. So when you look at your reflection, you're not just seeing the past, you're seeing the distance between who you once were and who you had to become. And those are the kinds of things you think about when the world goes dark and everything is quiet and it's 1 in the morning. Sometimes when you look in the mirror, you can still see who you once were.